All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this session of Stormwater Awareness Week. Like I said, this is our part 2 of our Kick the Can BMP inspections, where we're looking at BMPs in the field. And we're going to touch on some similar themes, right, Mike, as far as what we did last session?
Sure, yeah.
And what are some of the things we're going to be looking at in this session?
We're going to be talking about track out, water bars, check dams, stockpiles, some equipment. And then finally, one of the ones that pops up all the time for us is that how the water board will accept NOTs and what they'll have a little pushback about.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of change and development, I should say, in that whole area as far as what is acceptable today or what used to be acceptable, I should say, is no longer acceptable for getting NOTs accepted.
That's true.
So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I think we have most people on. And so, Mike, you're back out at a site here. And so what's everybody going to be looking at in this segment?
We're going to be looking at what ends up happening is I found a site that was just starting construction. They had just cut a road in to get to the site up a pretty good incline, and they had created a couple of water bars to direct the possibility of water if there was a storm prior to them really installing all their BMPs. So they were doing a good job in this aspect.
All right, let's take a look at this.
All right, so here's a unique situation, and here a project has just started. So they've come in and they've graded off all the topsoil, and so we have kind of an open exposed soil which creates a lot of sediment. But prior to them doing a temporary BMP here, they have done some things that are really effective. So you can see they've cut a trench through here, which we call a water bar. So all we're looking for is the slow down the flow. So that's the big key. And as you can see, they built another water bar, which, you know, is another word for a speed bump. But basically they're redirecting the water so that when it comes here, it doesn't go all the way off into the street and then down into an MS4. So they've got this here. When you come down here, they have a biodegradable sock. They have some rock bags holding it in before it gets to the storm drain. So this is an excellent temporary situation that they have created before they really start to work and before they really consider water truck here and what temporary BMPs they're going to have heading up into the rainy season. So wanted to give you this as a BMP to look at. All right, we'll go to the next one.
All right, and let me just I'm going to stop to share for a moment. I noticed my screen's freaking out a little bit. Just give me a second here. All right, so Mike, now water bars we typically think of as a speed bump, but in this case, it's an inverted speed bump. It's actually kind of a dip. How is that working?
Well, actually, the way they created this, it was very interesting, is that they put, if you would look back up top, they had a couple of places where they created kind of a little hump in the road, and then it came down, and then it came to these little trenches. But actually that works really well. I mean, it's basically a quick temporary fix to having either rock bags, having fiber rolls, having something redirect the water. So if there was a case of a freak storm that popped up this time of the year, they would be able to control their sediment more than just letting it flow right down onto the street and into an MS4.
Right. Now I want to back this clip up a little bit and take a look at this area. So they've done some BMPs. We see the rolling dips to keep it from getting sheet flow straight down. They still have some BMPs to address here, right? I mean, we were coming, that was pretty good from a water bar point of view, and they had some DI protection, but they still have lots of concerns. What are some of those?
Well, the concerns is they have basically no erosion controls. So if something happened and then they don't have, outside of that, let's just say they're going to put their sediment controls in to start with, they don't have those installed. They don't have really a good way to slow the flow. I was duly impressed only because they had just started this road today. But one of the things that we always have to look at is that what happens if a freak storm comes up. They're supposed to have these BMPs installed, you know, prior to construction starting.
Right.
So yeah, I gave them a win on the water bars because that was very unusual for them to have that, and then to have DI protection with the socks and the sandbags was definitely a start, because most times when I see a project like this, there's nothing.
Right. I'm just trying to get another picture. Right here is what I wanted to do. So there we see a DI. We see some protection. They have weighted down fiber rolls. Actually, they have the biodegradable fiber rolls, and there is some staking there. So I would actually give that BMP probably a B- to B+ grade. Not too bad. I would prefer to see some compost socks here because just as we were mentioning, when fiber rolls are not installed correctly, even around a DI, what happens is water builds up and then it can start jetting under and undermining it, even when they're weighed down like this. But that, you know, may do a decent job, but we see a big sediment load up here. So really, they probably want to have some good track out controls. Yes, some Edward just commented, they really should have a TC1 set up here for their track out control. In fact,
sure, they had a small amount of gravel. Yeah, they had a small amount of gravel right at the base. Like I say, this was just an interesting, I couldn't believe that they had anything. So for them to have these things, like you say, they needed track out controls, they needed all these things, but it looks like somebody had some idea to be able to create something better than nothing.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point. Sometimes we have to be careful in how we engage with some of the contractors. We want to be encouraging. We want to speak the truth. We want to call the balls and strikes, like you said that last session, as a good umpire. But sometimes we're also a coach. And we want to say, okay, here's what you're doing right with this situation. We see DI protection, we see water bars, those are all really good. We see a little bit of track out control. We know you're sweeping, but here's some room for improvement. Another question, are compost socks still effective on disturbed soil? Yes and no. So it depends how we configure them, and it depends how much sediment load we have. And it can be generally true of all BMPs that you can put any given BMP into a situation that is hopeless. In other words, the sediment load is so great that no matter how good that BMP is, you're going to overwhelm it. And compost socks are wonderful BMPs. We've seen them do amazing things, but you certainly can place them in a situation that is maybe overwhelming. And so perhaps one ring of compost sock around that drain inlet is not going to be enough. For a couple of reasons. What I just mentioned, sediment load being too high, too great. But the other reason is hydrology. An 8-inch diameter compost sock will allow 7 GPM, 7 gallons per minute per linear foot. Now you can notice that circle around that DI is pretty tight. I don't know, what's the circumference on that? Maybe 8 feet, maybe 10 at the most.
Oh yeah, not that. Yeah,
probably 2 by 2 by 2 at the most. That's right. Probably 8 feet's probably being generous. True. So 8 times 7 is 56 GPM. Chances are you're probably seeing a little bigger flow than that happen there. So how could we make that more doable? Would be to widen our circle. Now we only have so much room to work with in this picture. Another way is to stack. So we can put 2 compost stocks on the base, a third compost stock on top of that. Effectively now each linear feet, we now have 14 GPM instead of 7. Or we can go with a larger diameter compost stock of like a 12-inch diameter, which would give us 11 GPM per linear foot. So Good question from Kara about whether that would be adequate there or not.
And this reminds me, when you look at a site like this, like I've seen roads like this when a rainstorm is coming in. So the question all of a sudden becomes the fact that, are you going to have erosion? The answer is yes. And what are you going to do about it in a quick situation? And so you talk to the contractor about several things, you know, just temporary BMP, straw, whatever it takes. Because if that's your last line of defense, if that storm drain is it, even if you have these water bars and enough rain comes down, then it's going to overwhelm everything you have in place.
Yeah, and just looking at this picture a little bit more, what makes me really nervous about this, in the last segment, we talked about that track out controls should never slope to the street.
Right.
Well, generally speaking, that's where the water's headed. Now, the water bars are helping it now go here, which is good on one hand. It's not going out into the street, but we still have this lower area that we'd be concerned with. So I think the best BMP here would be to really stabilize this roadway. Either get asphalt in early and try to get this roadway installed to at least the first lift of asphalt, or go ahead and lay down geotextile and rock and make this a stabilized construction roadway, kind of like the one you showed in the last segment, Mike, where you saw that aggregate on the roadway.
Sure.
Because this is going to be a sample point right here. And I would be really concerned about this heavy sediment load coming here and having some pretty turbid numbers there. So definitely an area that you need to look at. All right, let's move on to the next one then. Forward it. All right, Mike, what are we looking at here?
Well, you're looking at track out controls, and the track out controls have been there for, you know, early in the season, and there's been a lot of activity. And so just looking at what it looks like if you just put your track out controls in and don't do any maintenance.
All right, let's take a look at
Mike
this.
with WGR. Now we're going to discuss track outs. So this is one thing that a state inspector told me. He said if he drives by a construction site and he says track out, he can see, then he's going to pull in. He said it's a big red flag saying we don't manage our track out, so more than likely we don't manage anything on our property. So just a heads up to be able to talk to your contractors and your clients about track out. It's one of the things that happens year round. And so it's just not in the rainy season where they're tracking mud out. Well, here's a perfect example. So they're using this again and again and again. And so you see that there's a small amount of sediment build up. And so I would talk to the contractor about needing to sweep this daily. If you look back into the property, you can see that they had some road base down here, and over time, just driving back and forth has created, you know, kind of a baby powder, we call it. And so there's really no way to mitigate this other than bringing in some larger rock, and it's always about maintenance. So track out is always about maintenance. And a lot of times I get a little pushback about track out in the summertime because like, what's the big deal? I can sweep it up. But just always remember that our job is to just be like an umpire. We just call it like we see it, balls and strikes. So if this needs maintenance, you just point it out. It's up to them to take care of it. You're not out here to basically redo it for them, but you're just out here to encourage them to, you know, stay in compliance. But always remember about track out. Like I say, it's number one button for a couple of inspectors that I know that said that they'll pull in to a site immediately if they see track out. All right, we're going to go to the next one.
All right, great. And let's back this up a little bit to get a view of the driveway here. Let's see, I think it was right here. Yeah, right there. Now, when the construction general permit, a lot of people are surprised to find out at how little the construction general permit talks about track out control. It talks about that you need to have it, but what I mean is it doesn't call out a spec. It doesn't say thou shalt use 3x5 rock. It doesn't say it must be underlain with geotextile. It doesn't say how long or how wide it should be or how deep it should be or whether you need a rattle trap or whether you could use 3/4 inch crushed gravel or It doesn't say any of that. All it says is that it must be effective. And in one of the last classes or the workshop that Mike did, the first part one, you saw the results, right? One trip, Mike, what happened?
One trip and there was track out. We went over rock, rattle trap, rock, and one trip, one vehicle, one rotation of the tires, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And there was sediment that tracked out just past all our controls.
So what we learned by that is even the best track out controls is going to need maintenance and sweeping. But when it comes to a permit, it's really performance based. It says it must be effective. It doesn't say what you need to use. And then we get this question asked to us all the time, huh, Mike? Can I use pea gravel? Can I use AB? And what would you tell someone like that?
You can use whatever you want as long as it's effective.
Yeah. And effective means what's happening out in the street.
Yeah. No sediment leaving site, everything remaining on site.
Yeah. So there comes a point, though, when your sweeping program cannot stay up with it. And then that's a pretty good gauge that it's not effective.
And that's an easy visual to take a contractor out and show him that you may think that you have an effective program here, but you don't because of what's in the street.
Okay. And you talk about, Mike, that a lot of people think that they should only really have this in place during the wet season. We see a lot of problems with the dry season, don't we?
Oh, true. Because when this rock, gets dried out and vehicles drive back and forth, it creates what we call baby powder. It's just so many fines, and it just tracks out no matter what. Every vehicle that comes out tracks them out, and you can see the evidence in the street. There's just tire tracks after tire tracks. So there's just as much sediment. A lot of times in the wintertime, it's more mud, big clumps of mud. But there's a lot of sediment that comes out in the dry season.
Yeah, and wind erosion as well, carrying it out too. Many times we'll see large track outs happening in the dry season because people aren't prepared for it. They're doing dust suppression, so the roadways pick up a certain amount of moisture on the site, but they're not really prepared to do some sweeping in the streets.
And this also, I've been on sites where they assume that, well, I have a water truck, and so as long as I water everything down, it kind of compacts and keeps it in place. And sometimes they can make more of a mess at the track out controls with flooding with water than they can if they were driving over the dry powder.
So what do? You get your water truck out on the road here and wash it down, right?
Yeah, you blow it right back into the job site so that the next 6 vehicles that come out bring it back out, and you have a vicious cycle that you can't fix.
Do we have any municipal inspectors online? I thought I saw Peter with Riverbank. I don't know. He was in one of our earlier classes, but I can tell you what a municipal inspector would say about that. All right. Well, let's move on. Let's go to the next one here. All right. What are we going to be showcasing here?
Well, I was driving up the hill on one job site, and I found some check dams put in that I was quite surprised, and they had done a great job. So it's just talking about check dams.
All right, let's take a look.
Okay, back again, Mike with WGR. Couldn't pass this up once I saw it. I thought we'd stop. We don't get to see this often. But what's been put down here last winter or last spring was a jute net or mesh. And so what the thing that they have done is they've put these little check dams all the way down through here. So this is biodegradable fiber roll. They put check dams trying to redirect the water back inside to where they can control it. And the silt fence is there to allow water to pool there and to slowly dissipate, either evaporate or infiltrate, or if it builds up, it could go around, and there's more check dams down through there. Because the ultimate thing for us in stormwater is this: if you get on a slope like this, you know that there's going to be erosion. So there isn't a question there's going to be erosion and sedimentation. So the question is how are you going to control it? So this is the perfect example of, as the water starts to speed up, it has to slow down, and it has to slow down, and it has to slow down. So this is a great example. Once we started to pass it, I thought we'd stop and just take a look at it. All right, we're going to go on to the next. Thanks.
All right, well, that is a wonderful, we see a lot of things working here. This is a wonderful example. Let's go let's see, just a little further. Right here. All right, how many things do we see working for us right here? We talked about perimeter controls, and look at installed exactly like we talked in the last segment. Doing exactly, butting them up, J-hooking them across, channeling. Where's that flow going to go? They're channeling it back into the hillside. We're going to get sedimentation here. So we got good sediment controls. Look at, they're staked down about every 4 feet. It's hard to tell, but they do look like they're keyed in. It looks like they are. You have your jute netting here, and in the swale, stabilized swale. We have vegetation on the hillside, even in the swale itself, and lots of good measures here.
And because I had a bird's eye view, farther down where that silt fence is the silt fence is in the shape of a V facing uphill. So everything is going to be captured in that silt fence, and then finally the sediment hopefully will settle out there. And then if it goes around that silt fence, it runs into some more check dams.
Okay, good. We do have a question. I think it goes back to our track out control. Says, I'm still learning here. Where do you put the dust from the track out once it's swept up? Good question. Now, Lindsay, what we're going to make an assumption here is that we don't have any odd situation where it's maybe a contaminated site, a Superfund site or something like that. Okay, so we're going to assume it's an average construction site and there's no reason to believe that it's contaminated. If for any reason you believe it's contaminated, then there's a whole nother process to go through it. But recovered sediment can go onto a stockpile. It can go onto a disturbed soil area that you're still working. It can be sent to a landfill. It can go even any of those areas. So as long as it's not placed in a location that would be vulnerable to erosion and be susceptible to, like, for example, you wouldn't want to place it right next to a DI. You'd want to remove it and put it somewhere else on the site. But good question.
Great.
Any other comments or questions regarding what we're looking at here? Just double check here. All right. But yeah, no, this is a really good control. And I cannot understate the importance, or I should say, I can't overstate the importance of understanding the proper use of perimeter controls, and that this is allowing us to capture our sediment as we go down the hillside. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Great.
All right, Mike, looks like we're back at a stockpile. Now, we looked at stockpiles earlier, and stockpiles come in all sizes, shapes, and forms, and materials even. I know, depending on what you're stockpiling, you might not only need to have a cover, you might need to have something under it. Like Caltrans, we just got done with the workshop with Caltrans. If you're stockpiling cold patch, they expect it to be on plastic as well as covered by plastic.
And I've seen all kinds of things in stockpiles. I've seen, mostly you find soil. That's the majority of it. But I've seen, old piping, things that has been dug up on site, shoved into the plastic, rusted, and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing what you find underneath.
Right. And there's some things that should not be stockpiled. And one of the things that should not be stockpiled would be trash. Trash should not go into a stockpile. Now, I know we can get into a point where it's no longer trash, but it's demolition rubbish where it needs to be stockpiled, or it's concrete that's been broken up. But I'm talking about just solid waste, paper, wood scraps, you name it, in it. That needs to go into a bin. It needs to be in a bin, covered in a bin, Because if it's not appropriately contained, technically it's a violation of the permit. And it needs to be in a bin. In fact, it could trigger a non-visible pollutant sampling requirement, just as a bin that's leaking out liquid and not covered appropriately could trigger the non-visible pollutant sampling requirement.
Oh, all those bins are permanently sealed, aren't they?
Yeah, right. Just like they're covered every night, right?
Yes. Well, what's interesting too is depending on what county you're working in, I've run into some county inspectors that have called the contractor on, stockpile of either busted up cement or extra pour outside the slab or something just piled up. And I always, have a conversation about, well, it can't be, re-emulsified with water. So it is dry. And their big thing is that they really just don't want a pile of debris, no matter kind of what it is, on the job site for any length of time.
Right. And whether it's covering a stockpile at the end of the day or when it's not actively being used, or it's covering the bin at the end of each day, like the permit says, or during storm events, lots of times, an inspector will come out, a water board inspector especially, and what the answer always is, oh, we're using it, right? It's active.
Yeah.
It's active.
Always
of course
active.
It's active.
Yeah.
And you know what? In our region, and I know we have people joining us from all over the state, but in our region, Region 5, when the inspectors many times will do their first inspection, it's like at 3:30 or 4 p.m. That's their first drive-by. And like Mike said, if they see track out or they see certain of these red flags waving in the air, like uncovered stockpiles, that's pretty much going to assure you a visit during business hours. But they'll come, the next day at the job site and go, hey, your bin or your stockpile is not covered. And of course, the contractor's going to say, it's active, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I was here last night at 4 p.m. and I didn't see anybody and it wasn't covered.
Or I cover it every evening.
Yes. So let's watch this clip.
Hi, Mike with WGR back again. Okay, one of the things that we want to talk about is stockpile and the maintenance and just the care for stockpile. Now, basically the permit calls for any inactive soil to be covered and bermed. And so this is an example of a stockpile. And so as you can see, it's covered in plastic. It's not necessarily bermed, but they've got sandbags holding it, kind of the plastic in place, because a lot of wind comes through this one area. And so, that's a good idea. But as we kind of walk around and take a look at this, you can see that just like with anything, you can't just put something in place and have it last for, a long time. So here's an example of some plastic that's either been, some of it's open, some of it looks like they've piled a little more debris on top. So ultimately, any BMP that we use basically is just going to require maintenance. So here's some wind that's caught the plastic and separated the plastic. Plus, this plastic is only good for so long. And with winds and just the climate that we have, just the sun in the summertime, you really have to pay attention to the maintenance of this. So this is kind of an out of sight, out of mind. But a lot of times, we put this in our report because this is one of the topics that we're always concerned with is dust control. And so if this plastic starts to degrade or starts to blow off because of wind, then of course, you've got maintenance that's always got to be taken care of. So what's a real treat about this site is that around it is all vegetated. So even if there were a rainstorm to come in and some sediment did leave, it would be captured right here. So this is a pretty good site. Sometimes the stockpiles are in the middle of a project and it's all exposed soil. And so that's another condition you got to worry about. Also with plastic, one of the things that we worry about, this is a relatively small stockpile, but sometimes we see stockpiles that are maybe 12, 15 feet in height. They can vary. And we think that, okay, I'm just going to cover it in plastic. If I hear a rainstorm is coming or in a kind of an emergency situation, I'm going to do it really quickly, being reactive. Well, what you have to do is you have to really pay attention to what your soil is like on the perimeter of this stockpile, because if your soil is exposed and it's not covered like this side is, then you've made a giant water slide that's going to speed up the water flow down. It's going to hit the exposed soil if it's out there, and it's going to really make a bigger mess than you can anticipate. So a lot of times we use this as a temporary BMP, but sometimes we'll recommend that they cover it in straw, something that won't allow the water to shed off in such a high rate of speed, and will be a lot more effective. But like I say, it really depends on your site, where you are. If you're in the middle of an exposed soil site, then that's going to be more of a challenge. But if you're someplace like this that's relatively flat and is surrounded by native grasses, then it's a lot less liability. But this is always a concern about stockpiles. All right, well, we're going to go on to the next one.
All right, you bring up some really good points here, Mike, and there is a controversy too, and I think I'd like to bring this up too. Sometimes we get really fixated on how BMPs should be installed and what they should look like, and so you have the proverbial plastic lined stockpile with sandbags on it, surrounded by fiber roll. And we get that mental image that that's what a stockpile should look like. And so if you have a stockpile, you talk to your crew, your laborers, and say, okay, we need to get this stockpile covered. And of course, they're picturing the same mental image, right? Black plastic, sandbags, fiber roll around it. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, if not 99 times out of 100, that fiber roll is just placed on top of the plastic and not staked down or anything, just circles it. And, I have to look at that as an erosion control professional and go, that's window dressing. And it's really not. It's not berming. It's not effective. It's basically worthless. So we many times, I think, need to think outside of the box. And that's what you were addressing here, Mike, is I believe is one, let's consider getting rid of the black plastic, because let's face it, it's just a maintenance headache. The winds come up and it's going to do what you see here. You're always fighting it, right, Mike?
Yeah, there's no way around the wind and the degradation that happens of the plastic with the sun, and it just doesn't make any sense. Even where this is on a big flat piece of ground, it's just not the best use of a BMP.
So I would argue that a better way to comply with a permit for a stockpile like this, and I guess I should also preface that each stockpile is kind of unique. This one, really, there's nothing going on around here. I have to believe, without being out at this site, that this stockpile has been there for quite some time.
Oh, a long time.
And it really is not being used. So this is really not the best way to manage this particular stockpile. Now, maybe black plastic over a small, quite active, quite frequently used stockpile, maybe in a staging area with fiber roll around it, is maybe not a bad idea. But here, I think we could do this a lot better and probably save the contractor a lot of headaches. Like you said, get rid of that plastic. It's just going to fall apart, and put some straw down on it, maybe with a tackifier as well. And in fact, if you use straw from the feed store, chances are it's going to be oat straw, and it will actually start growing oats on it.
Yeah.
And that'll be a much more perennial type of BMP that will be durable. And as far as berming it, like you said, this location is very low threat. I think you could effectively argue that the vegetation surrounding it is pretty good containment. I would argue that too. I think you can find places, and this site, it is kind of suggested, just what we're looking at here, that you can find a place where you're placing the stockpile in a low point where it's not going to go anywhere.
Sure.
And to me, that would be adequate containment, adequate berming, especially for a long-term storage. So we like to challenge QSPs to think outside the box, get beyond the normal stereotypical picture of what these BMPs need to look like, and really kind of consider what are they supposed to be doing. And I think it's self-defeating. We've seen this, right, Mike, where this black plastic is left out too long and all of a sudden it's turning into shards. And now we got pieces, 6-inch pieces of black plastic all over that field.
All over the field. Yep.
And that's a nightmare. Boy, if a regulator picks up on that, talk about the headaches you've just created for yourself.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to clean that up in a field like that.
Yeah. So good. Any questions about stockpiles? Anybody got comments? We do see ridiculous things sometimes. You know, I have a picture that I show in my training from time to time of giant riprap in a stockpile. And really, do I need to cover this? But just the other day, I had a large concrete debris in a stockpile. And kind of same question. Okay, do we need to cover it? But then when you look closer, on the ground is all this concrete dust. It was almost like it had been spray painted white that was coming off of that. So sometimes it's more than just the obvious. You got to look closely. Here's a question or maybe a comment. If you're using straw with a tackifier, do you need special equipment to mix and place it? And Kara, no, not necessarily. In fact, a smaller situation like we're looking at right here, I would have a couple laborers out there hand scatter it because we don't have any real aggressive slopes with this. You can tell it's shorter than Mike, it appears. It's probably 4 feet high at the most. And I would probably hand scatter straw on that, give it a pretty good blanket, and then mix up some of my own tackifier with and apply it with Hudson sprayers. Is one way to do it. That might, this is kind of borderline, but if you're trying to do it on the cheap, that might be a good way of doing it. And the other thing is timing. If you're willing to maintain that straw for a little bit, once that straw gets wet, especially if you lay down a pretty good mat of it, once it gets wet, it will typically stay in place. Now, if you're in a real windy situation, it might drive you crazy for a while. That's why you want to put the hairspray on it. But if it's not real windy and you get some wet weather, typically you'll create a nice mat and it'll stay in place.
And then, for us as stockpiles, there's always a question from the contractor. And I ran into this with a regulator in Oakland. The contractor had a bunch of pretty good size, like half the size of normal river rock delivered because of an area that he was going to cover in this. And he had, I don't know, 4 or 5 trucks deliver, pretty good size of it. And the regulator was there when I arrived, and he was telling him that you need to, cover those stockpiles. And his argument was, that's not a stockpile of dirt, that's a stockpile of rock. Why would I possibly cover a stockpile of rock? And this regulator was rather calm individual. And he just basically said, well, because more than likely when they picked all that rock up, they picked up some sediment and some other things in the, using the equipment. So that's why you need to cover it. So anyway, so that was interesting, but I've been in other places like in our area where that isn't a concern. So It just maybe depends. Sometimes stockpiles are not always applicable.
All right, good. Let's move on.
Hi. Yeah, Mike.
Let's the arrow here. All right, great. Okay, so Mike, we're going to switch our focus now to maybe good housekeeping and pollution prevention techniques. And what are you going to be looking at here?
Well, anytime I go on a job site of any type, I always go and I find their equipment. If they have any equipment that they're storing, it's hard to tell usually when they're using the equipment. Although you can, you can still tell if hydraulic hoses are leaking and that kind of thing. But I go find the equipment and I start looking underneath it, and I see if there's any spills. I see if there's, any signs of diesel spilled, and then usually I go find the contractor and ask him. One of the first questions I ask is do you have a designated place where you do refueling and where you keep your equipment? And that, our SWIP is fluid, it can change. But That's usually how I engage. So this is what I look at this is what I look for when I go on a site for equipment.
All right, let's take a look at this.
Okay, now here we are with some equipment. So one of the things that we always look for when I go on a construction site is the equipment and the storage. Where are they keeping their equipment, and what does it look like? What kind of shape is it in? And so it's always, what is the impact if stormwater were to come? So I look kind of underneath the vehicles that are here to see, you know, is there any hydraulic fluid? Is there any diesel fuel? Is there a leak of any kind? And if there is, then I would go find the contractor and address that kind of a thing. So that's what you want to do. Everything is about, you know, what kind of an impact something is happening is, you know, with stormwater. So always we need to take a look at the equipment and kind of see, you know, it's in a good shape. And if it is, then great. If you see a leak or anything like that, then you need to point it out to the contractor and find out, make sure they got a spill kit on site, those kind of things. So that's another thing that we can talk about. I guess we can walk down here. I see that there is one of the things that's always in question and comes up a lot is, you know, what is there construction material stored on site? And if there is construction material stored on site, you know, is it going to be impacted by stormwater? So a lot of times when you look around, like this particular job site has a bunch of concrete precast and they have some piping and different things. And so really stormwater is not going to do anything to this. But if you show up on a job site and say that there's a pallet of some cement or something that's uncovered, broken bags, that kind of thing, then you always have to really think through, you know, what is the impact going to be if stormwater can get to this? So when we talk about construction material, it can be anything. This particular site, they're just starting to, you know, do their underground work, so it's mostly plastic pipe, mostly pieces of concrete, like you see in the background. And so the impact isn't really crazy in this situation, but I just wanted to point out those couple of items. All right, we'll see you on the next one.
All right, so I have a funny story about this. Just happened yesterday. So I was doing an inspection, a follow-up inspection. It was a staging area, much similar to this, and they had heavy equipment, very similar to this site here. And last week, I had noticed that they had some spills of oil, grease, fuel from fueling equipment, from maintenance. Basically, there were spots on the soil, and the soil was a real powdery, sandy material. In fact, that's a whole nother problem. Was it was a dust bowl just waiting to happen. But I went out to do my follow-up inspection yesterday to make sure the spills were cleaned up, and it looked wonderful. No more stains, no more. You know, it looked like they did it. I questioned them. They said, "Oh yeah, we dug it up. We've put it aside. We're going to treat it as hazardous waste." And in fact, it looked like they had brought a water truck in and watered everything down. It looked great. Took pictures. So I drive back to the office. I get out of the office and I'm like, I get out of my truck at the office. And I'm like, what is that black stuff on my floor mat? And I look at my shoes. I'm go, oh, those turkeys. They just raked over the dust over it. And I had all the, you know, it's like a kid again at Huntington Beach, all the crude oil stuck to my boot, what they had done. So not the way to clean up a spill, by the way. Maybe a good way to fool your QSP one time, but
Yeah.
Believe me, I'm going to be looking closer next time. So it brings up a good point, Mike. What you're talking about is, you know, when you got heavy equipment like that, you're going to have leakers. You're going to have fueling that needs to happen. You're going to have a certain amount of maintenance that's probably going to be happening. What type of BMPs do they need to have in place?
Well, one thing's for sure is I usually talk about if you're going to have a fueling station, you need to have secondary containment. Make sure that the gentleman that's doing the fueling or the maintenance has spill kit on his truck in case something does get spilled, that he can capture it. But yeah, don't just leave your things on the dirt to leak and think, well, it's on the dirt, it's not on asphalt, so it's probably not a problem. Yeah, secondary containment is a big thing. for equipment and where your fueling station is, because you've got diesel, gasoline, you know, probably antifreeze, hydraulic fluid. You've got some things that are, you know, really cause problems. So definitely parking your equipment, especially if you have any leaks, which probably 50% of the equipment that I see has some sort of a leak. I don't think you can work the equipment as hard as they work it without having some hose break loose sooner or later. So yeah, secondary containment is a big thing.
Yeah, and when we talk about secondary containment, it can take all sorts of forms. But at a minimum, what we want to see are drip pans, basically, that you can put underneath your where you're fueling, so that if you have some drips or when you're, you know, putting the nozzle in or pulling the nozzle out, that you can catch that. Or if you you overtop it, then it can catch it. Or if you're doing maintenance, then putting down plastic would be ideal, so that it's not going into the ground. It's being caught on the plastic. If it's an area where you do a lot of that, then maybe some sandbags. In fact, Mike, we actually created a secondary containment using fiber roll and plastic sheeting. Again, temporary, right? We don't leave it long term.
Yeah, sure. It was temporary. We set it out. It was about a 12 by 15. We wrapped the plastic around the fiber roll, weighted down the fiber roll from on top with bags all the way around, and kind of created a little secondary containment really simply and really inexpensive.
Yeah. Those need management. So they're great during the dry season, not so great during the wet season, especially if there have been some drips in them. You don't want stormwater getting in there, picking up a sheen, and now you got water with a sheen in your secondary containment. That's probably when, if you have to have that type of situation, you want to have it covered so that you're not collecting a bunch of contaminated water. And remember, if you have spilled material you've picked up, or you have used absorbent pads or booms or granular absorbent, or oily rags and debris, that's all hazardous waste, and that needs to go into a haz waste drum and labeled, and you got some dates that you have to also pay attention to. Okay, good. See, just check, see how we're doing on time and questions. All right, I think we got one more, right, Mike?
Okay.
One more, right?
Okay, let me go to the next one here. All right, so we're going to talk about the project's done. Now what? So we're notices of termination, and what does the water board and regional board expect to see in order for you to close out your permit? So let's watch this video, then we'll talk about it.
Hello, Mike with WGR. I wanted to talk to you because I got the opportunity. I'm at a job site today that is ready to file an NOT. So I'm going to kind of show you a few things that we've run into when filing an NOT that has got the NOT returned. So let me kind of show you, and I'll walk through this project with you real quick. So as you can see, the fence is finished. It looks like all the landscape is finished. As I turn around here, you basically can see that this is a retention area. There's storm drain protection that they're going to keep in. And so this looks really good. They've done a great job. They don't have any exposed soil. This that I'm walking on is all infiltration material. So as we kind of come around the project and take a look, it looks like everything's complete. And so from the perspective of an NOT, they're looking for the job to be complete, the construction to be done. We don't really see any construction trucks, maybe one, but it's one of those things that as I walk around and show you, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So I always thought, well, if the outside, the way I understand the permit is if the outside of the project is complete, if they still had some interior construction going on, it wouldn't impact all the soil as long as the soil is covered on the outside. But this is one of the things that I have kind of learned over time, that the water board sees things a little bit differently than maybe just our common sense reasoning. And there it is. There is the reason that the NOT would be returned. I don't always know if it gets returned, but we have seen quite a few get returned because there's still a portable toilet and there's still a dumpster, because evidently there's some work going on inside these townhomes. And so that's the issue, is that it looks like when you're trying to get an NOT, you're taking pictures of the site, you're taking the site map and drawing in where the photos that you have taken belong, so that the water board can have a look and see that the site is indeed complete. And so by all aspects, when we look, everything is complete with the exception of these two items. They consider this construction material, and it can't be here, as well as any temporary BMPs. And fortunately, there are no temporary BMPs out here at this facility, so it's just the dumpster and the porta potty. Anyway, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of insight that we've seen a bit of pushback from the water board with us trying to file an NOT on a project. All right, this is Mike with WGR signing off. Thanks.
All right, great. Let's back this up to where we saw that. Right here, I think. Oh, and back here. All right. So, boy, there's a lot we could say about NOTs, and we're just about out of time. So we could dedicate a whole workshop to just NOTs, and maybe we will next Stormwater Awareness Week. That would be a very relevant topic, and a constantly changing topic. I'd love to see if we could get even a couple regional board people to join us about what they're looking for. But yeah, these are definitely flies in the ointment, aren't they, Mike?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I had one project up in the other side of Sac Airport that was completely done, completely finished, but the trash company had not picked up their dumpster, and they returned the NOT. And it was evident that there was no construction happening. But
this would be a double whammy photo to send. Not only are you showing the dumpster, but I think the water board's eyes are going to go to this spilled material right here.
That was as you got closer, that was some sheetrock dust, so it wasn't that it wasn't cement like I thought. But yeah,
but it brings up a good point. A lot of NOT is taking good pictures, and we've seen people take careless pictures, maybe that are not really representative. Maybe that small area is just glaring in the photo, and the regional board person can't get beyond it. So yeah, having a little wisdom about how you take your pictures, keep them representative, but also realizing that you could have some real problems. Yeah, and you're right. Yeah, the dumpster needs to be covered at the end of the day, since it's not raining, but at the end of the day it does too. But as far as an NOT, this is going to be the spoiler for it.
And then another thing with an NOT, John, that we always run into is the post-construction BMP long-term maintenance plan.
Right. And we saw some post-construction measures out there. I was actually kind of curious because I knew there were infiltration trenches you were walking through, but boy, it still looks like disturbed soil without knowing any better. Sure. I would want to explain that to the water board, what they're actually looking at. But yeah, you need to provide what post-construction measures you incorporate into that project, and then what they really want to see is the signed maintenance agreement between the owner of the project, the LRP, and the municipality, whoever's the one that approved that county or city. Now, that sounds easy, sounds straightforward, but we found that that's not always something that we can get our hands on. What gets really messy is when it is then being deeded over back to the city for, they're going to own it and maintain it. And getting the backup for that many times has been a real challenge to do that.
Or back over to the HOA.
Yeah. And lots of times, you know, we're uploading resolutions by the city or county that shows that they've accepted it, but the water board is looking for a particular thing, or many times it's a regional board person. So that's the other caveat, is you can have a little bit of different experience depending on where in the state you are and which regional board person is reviewing it. They may want more or less documentation. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time, Mike. So I'm going to stop the share there and just check, see if we have any questions. All right, good. So, all right, I don't see any questions. If you have a question and want to ask it real quick, go ahead and unmute yourself. Mike, I guess just to wrap this up, Friday's October 1st.
Sure.
What is the most important things that people should be doing right now at their job sites, getting ready for the wet weather? And we only have a minute.
Yeah, okay. Getting ready for the wet weather is just to look at your BMPs. Are they effective? Do you have, I always consider the fact that we're going to have some erosion, we're going to have some sedimentation. So how are you going to manage it? How are we going to mitigate what's happening? What does your track out controls look like? What does your overall job site look like? What BMPs are implemented? What phase of the project are you in? Is there BMPs that need to be changed out? Was there BMPs from last year that are still there that need to be changed? Just an overall picture of, okay, if it starts raining tomorrow, what's going to happen on this job site? So that's kind of how I always look at things, is the what if. And then I try to also be reasonable with the contractor, telling him where he's done a good job, he's done a great job, and where he needs a little bit of help, he needs some help.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining this Stormwater Awareness Week workshop. And you know, we have lots of great classes coming your way the rest of the week. We're not even halfway through yet. So today concludes Tuesday, but tomorrow we have some great classes. One of the classes I really enjoyed last year was with some engineering, talking about low impact development, and they have some very innovative things to talk about. So if you're a municipal reviewer or somebody who works with post-construction BMPs, you won't want to miss that. It's going to kick it off at 8 a.m. And then we have a session on active treatment systems tomorrow at 9:15. And then I hope you can join me. I'm going to be going out first thing in the morning to one of my favorite places in the world, Yosemite National Park. And I will be live streaming there from the Ahwahnee Meadow. It's a meadow restoration project that we worked with the National Park Service on. And I'm actually going to have some National Park Service staff with me. And we're going to be talking about the Ahwahnee Meadow and the Merced River and Stoneman Meadow restoration projects. So if you want to see some cool pictures of Half Dome and see it live, join us tomorrow at 10:30. But check out all of the other workshops at stormwaterawareness.org, and we hope to see you in one of our upcoming workshops. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.